around 500 BC, Greece, a rugged land, bore witness to remarkable achievements in the realms of art, philosophy, and warfare. Within its illustrious city-states, Athens, a maritime powerhouse, thrived as a center of democracy. In contrast, Sparta, renowned for its formidable military, embodied a deeply militaristic society. In 480 BC, these two city-states formed a formidable alliance to withstand the mighty Persian Empire's invasion. At the narrow passage of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by 300 Spartans valiantly held off the massive Persian army for 3 days, before finally succumbing to encirclement. Later, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek navy achieved a decisive victory over the Persian fleet. The subsequent year witnessed the Greeks securing a pivotal land victory over the Persians at Platella, forcing the invaders to abandon their campaign. The ensuing 5 decades marked the golden age of classical Greece. However, mounting tensions between Athens and Sparta, along with their respective allies, ultimately ignited a prolonged conflict, plunging the Greek world into decades of devastating warfare. These intra-Greek conflicts endured for nearly a century, leaving the city-states depleted and vulnerable to the rise of a new power to the north. For centuries, the cultured Greeks had long considered the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a distant and uncultured realm, barely qualifying as Greek. Yet under the rule of King Philip II, Macedonia underwent a remarkable transformation into a formidable military force. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army decisively defeated the combined forces of Thebes and Athens. Through a combination of alliances and conquests, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighboring regions. Following this triumph, he unified all of Greece, except Sparta, into a coalition known as the Hellenic League, with Philip as its supreme commander. Philip then embarked on ambitious plans for a pan-Hellenic campaign against the weakened Persian Empire. But tragically, on the eve of launching his grand campaign, Philip fell victim to assassination at the hands of his own bodyguard. His successor would be his son, Alexander III, who was only 20 years of age, being born in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon, in 356 BC. He was born to Philip's fourth wife, Olympias. In his early years, Alexander was taught by the strict Leonidas, relative of his mother. Alexander was raised in the manner of noble Macedonian use, learning to read, play the lyre, ride, fight, and hunt. When Alexander was 13, Philip began to search for a tutor. He would choose Aristotle and provided the Temple of Nymphis as a classroom. Nymphis was like a boarding school for Alexander and the children of Macedonian nobles. Many of these students would become his friends and future generals. Aristotle taught Alexander and his companions about medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic, and art. During his youth, Alexander was also acquainted with Persian exiles at the Macedonian court who received the protection of Philip II as they opposed the Persian king Artaxerxes. Alexander's early reign focused on consolidating his power. He executed potential rivals such as his cousin and 2 Macedonian princes involved in his father's assassination. The news of Philip's death sparked revolts in various states, including Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, and the Thracian tribes. Alexander responded swiftly, amassing troops and subduing Thessaly. He continued south, where he was recognized as the leader of the Hellenic League and received the title of hegemon in Corinth. Alexander would then march north, securing his northern borders by suppressing revolts in Thrace and Illyria, before once again marching south to quell another rebellion in Thebes and Athens. Alexander, upon reaching Thebes, would defeat the garrison and raze the city to the ground, which intimidated Athens into surrender and brought temporary peace to Greece. After securing his hold over the Greek states, Alexander would pick up where his father had left off. He would march through Thrace and begin making preparations for his army to cross the Hellespont into Persian-controlled Anatolia. When Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont, it would number around 40,000 strong, and would include 9,000 phalangists under the command of Parmenion, which made up the bulk of the Macedonian army and had been one of the key military reforms under Philip II. These heavily armored infantry were armed with the sarissa, a massive 18 to 20 foot pike. This weapon gave them a significant advantage over the shorter traditional spears used at the time. Each phalangist also carried a smaller double-edged sword and a shield that was designed to be carried by a sling over the shoulder due to the two-handed nature of the sarissa. The key to the phalangists' success was their formation, the phalanx. This close, ordered formation allowed for maximum protection, with each phalangist carrying his shield in a way that protected not only himself, but the right side of the soldier next to him. This formation was primarily offensive, designed to advance in a unified line into the heart of the enemy forces. The phalanx would have some substantial drawbacks, primarily its limited effectiveness on uneven terrain, which made it hard to maneuver, and the susceptibility of flanking from the enemy formation. So to counter these weaknesses, the Greeks would place Hypaspis on the right of the phalangists, under the command of Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The Hypaspis, also known as shield bearers, would number around 3,000. Although not as heavily armored as the phalangists, they were more mobile, characterized by their distinctive equipment and weaponry. They carried short spears or javelins. Their primary role was to provide support to the phalangists and to engage in close quarters combat when necessary. Behind the phalanx was positioned around 12,000 Greek and mercenary hoplites taken from across Greece. Their name came from the hoplon, a large round shield that provided essential protection on the battlefield. The hoplites were generally heavily armored and carried an 8-foot-long thrusting spear. The hoplites would also fight in the phalanx. Although not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, they were well trained and armored for the time. The Agriones would make up the army's elite skirmishers. They were excellent javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. The army would also include other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria, armed with javelins, slings, and bows. On both the right and left flanks were positioned cavalry. The cavalry would be utilized as the army's main shock troops, designed to make the decisive breakthrough of the enemy lines. There were two main divisions of cavalry, the companion and the prodromi. The latter was the more flexible and versatile Balkan cavalry, which was used primarily as scouts. The companion cavalry was the more important division, was commanded at first by Philotas. They were divided into 8 squadrons, each man carrying a 9-foot lance but wore little armor. Of course, the most important of these squadrons was that of Alexander. Alexander and his royal companions always fought on the right, while Callas commanded the Thessalian cavalry on the left flank. The tactics remained simple. The Macedonian phalanx would hit the center of the opposing army, while the cavalry would attack and punch holes on the flanks. The army was designed to attack, and when used correctly became a formidable fighting force. While well-trained soldiers are always essential for success, the army's leadership was remarkable. Besides Alexander, the force across the Hellespont had many capable officers that would ultimately lead Alexander's army to the edge of the known world. Before Philip had been murdered in 336, he sent Parmenion with an army of around 10,000 men into Anatolia to make preparations for his main invasion. At first, all went well. The Greek cities on the western coast of Anatolia would revolt, but soon the news that Philip had been murdered and had been succeeded by his young son Alexander would demoralize the Greeks, who would subsequently be defeated near Magnesia by the Achaemenids under the command of the mercenary Memnon of Rhodes. 2 years later, after securing his position in Greece, Alexander was ready to take over Philip's invasion. He marched his army to the Hellespont in early spring 334 BC, where he would make preparations to land in Anatolia 20 days later. Darius would have been informed about Alexander's movements for some time, maybe as early as the invasion force had left Macedon. This did not alarm the great king, who left the defense of Asia Minor to his local satraps. Since Persian satraps were provincial governors in Achaemenid Persia, they were appointed by the king and had authority over taxation, justice, security, and military affairs in their region. The Persian satraps and commanders in Anatolia would raise their army and encamp near Zelia. The army was most likely led by Arcides, the local satrap. The army also contained the satrap of Lydia, Ionia, and Cilicia, along with several other commanders. A council was held by the Persians to discuss the state of affairs, which would result in the Persian army taking up position on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, where they waited for Alexander's attack. When Alexander arrived at the river, the Persian army would number around 40,000 strong, roughly 10 to 20,000 cavalry, and roughly the same amount of infantry. The infantry would be made up of mostly Greek mercenaries, would be placed at the back of the formation, probably because the Persians did not trust them in battle against fellow Greeks. This is probably why the Persian force chose to defend a river crossing, and why the Persians stationed their cavalry in front along the bank of the Granicus. After both armies finished their deployment, there was a moment of silence. Alexander then ordered Amyntas with a squadron of companion cavalry to charge the Persian left flank, followed by the Paeonian cavalry, the prodromi, and an infantry unit. The Persians would answer the charge by launching a volley of javelins. Amyntas's force was at a disadvantage as they were severely outnumbered, and the Persians were defending higher ground at the top of the bank. The Macedonians suffered losses and were forced to retreat back towards Alexander, who was now advancing with the remainder of the right wing and the infantry. Whether the attack led by Amyntas was a failure or simply just a ruse, it drew the Persian cavalry out of formation as they pursued the retreating force of Amyntas into the riverbed. The disruption of the Persian formation made them vulnerable to a second attack, which, after being joined by Amyntas's force, slammed into the Persian force. Alexander and his men engaged the Persians and their leaders in a hard-fought battle. During the battle, Alexander was struck in the head by Rhoesaces, but the helmet protected him, and Alexander cut him down by thrusting him in the chest with his lance. From behind, Mithridates raised his sword to attack Alexander, but Clitus the Black anticipated this blow and cut off his arm, sword and all. The Macedonian cavalry eventually got the upper hand and established a foothold on the riverbank, allowing the infantry to reinforce Alexander's cavalry. At this point in the battle, the Macedonian cavalry and the light infantry were interspread. Together they forced back the Persian cavalry. This began on the Persian left flank where Alexander was fighting. Then the center was broken and the Persian cavalry on both wings fled. Alexander did not pursue them far, but turned his attention to the Greek mercenaries, who had mostly remained inactive at their original position. The mercenaries, surprised by the turn of events, were quickly attacked by both the foot companions from the front and the cavalry from all other directions. They were soon surrounded and massacred, and only a few were able to escape. For the Macedonians, Arrian gives losses of 25 companion cavalry in the preliminary attack, and 60 from the rest of the battle, and 30 foot soldiers lost, a total of 115 killed. For the Persians, estimates are around 1,000 cavalry and 2,000 to 3,000 infantry were killed, while 2,000 Greek mercenaries were taken prisoner and sent back to Greece as slaves. The battle would also claim the lives of many Persian leaders, giving the total Persian losses around 5,000. After the defeat, the province of Dascilium was evacuated by its Persian garrisons and would be occupied by Parmenion. Alexander would send troops to the many cities that were still under Persian control, which would mostly surrender without a fight. Alexander had just won his first stunning victory over the Persian Empire, but with news of a real threat in the west, he was about to meet his biggest challenge yet, as the Persian High King Darius would begin raising his army, preparing to march to meet Alexander, a fight which would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. thank you everybody for watching. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts, and consider liking and subscribing, as it truly helps me make a better video for everybody. And as always, thank you for watching The Knowledge Show.